Welcome back to another expectation subverting and expansion pack inserting episode of What Happened, the YouTube style pop culture media show that's
available for your home in 1995.
Listen, I had to get that one out of my system as soon as I could. Now, speaking of systems, Nintendo's third home console is often viewed as a pretty big turning point for the company, as it represented their earliest intent to do something radically different and go against the grain when everyone else was following trends, for better or worse.
It's me, Mario!
Yeah, tell it to the judge.
Get in or get out.
The fact is, as many classic gaming experiences the little gray fun machine offered during its 6-year run as Nintendo's flagship console, its inception, specs, marketing, and, well, pretty much everything is often cited as an example of Nintendo's inability to recognize the potential of certain technologies. The console's development is of course linked directly to that, and it's certainly not as straightforward as you'd expect, as it involved a truly unlikely partnership, the burning of several others, broken promises, release delays, and plenty of quiet cancellations. So grab your 3-prong controllers and rumble packs as I answer the question, what happened to the Nintendo 64?
Here we go!
Nintendo famously starts work on their next video game console the moment they finalize the last one. And as early as 1992, things started moving in a particular direction, but in a very unparticular way. Silicon Graphics Inc. was tapped to make a real-time 3D Mario marketing gimmick that would talk, but mostly just annoy attendees at that year's CES show. While primitive today, of course, this precursor to VTubing wowed Nintendo, and marked the earliest instance of Charles Martinet playing the role of the portly plumber. This collaboration between both SGI and Nintendo went so well, in fact, that it established a link that would prove extremely important in the coming years. Now, at the time, Silicon Graphics' main business was producing 3D visuals for use in the private sector, like for presentations, marketing, the boring stuff. But they had just started dipping their toes into more commercial efforts, like providing the computing power for special effects in Hollywood blockbusters, something they wanted to expand into even further. That led to their participation with Jurassic Park. And after the 3D Mario presentation, they also saw the value in getting on board with the fastest growing entertainment medium, video games. The pitch was simple. SGI's graphical technology would reduce costs as well as computing power, but could also still produce impressive, high-quality results. But instead of Nintendo, CEO of Silicon Graphics, Jim Clark, brought their pitch first to Sega of America and Tom Kalinske, whose hat raised to the ceiling once he saw what SGI was packing, and already had pen in hand to sign on the dotted line. Sega of Japan, however, completely nixed the idea, which shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with their history of making their own unique and sometimes perplexing choices. So, Jim Clark, remembering their 3D Mario Tuber collab, brought his company's pitch back to Nintendo and their then president, Hiroshi Strong Style Yamauchi, who, to the surprise of many, loved the pitch. And thus SGI's technology became the basis on which the Nintendo 64 would be built upon. Now, while an unexpected pairing at first, the timing synced up well with Nintendo's ideology, which had been shaped through their failed partnership with Sony on the ill-fated SNES CD add-on, and the string of CD-based consoles that weren't generating much excitement, like the 3DO or the lowly Amiga CD32.
The Amiga CD32. Fuck this thing, watch it go.
But with a partner now in place for the hardware, it was now up to Nintendo on how the games themselves would be made and on what format. And obviously that decision would be one of, if not the most important one Nintendo would make up to that point. Now, allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment, but there were plenty of legit reasons to be wary of the CD format in the very early 90s, as the consoles and peripherals that use them were not particularly very hype, as the technology just wasn't there yet. Grainy FMV clips and lengthy load times were not exactly the type of thing you'd want to have to design your entire flagship machine around, and thus Nintendo didn't bother, feeling that the technology was more suited for movies and music rather than games.
How about a kiss for luck?
You've got to be kidding.
There was also the issue of piracy, and early on there was this stigma that CDs were incredibly easy to copy and distribute. And so Nintendo believed that their own custom cartridges would be a way to combat that. On the other hand, advancements in technology usually move quite fast, so Nintendo dismissing CDs so early in their life cycle would obviously hurt them a little bit later. There was one other very critical benefit to compact discs though, and that was their much lower manufacturing costs, something Nintendo, in their ignorance or confidence, didn't pay much attention to. Hell, they didn't even pay attention when, according to former Sony Interactive Entertainment president Shuhei Yoshida, that Squaresoft had pleaded with Nintendo to dump cartridges. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, loved the potential of CDs. His dream was to create a movie-like Final Fantasy game. He was disappointed when he learned that the Nintendo 64 still used cartridges. His movies couldn't fit there. Squaresoft tried to convince Nintendo to change that plan, but they wouldn't. Fortunately for Nintendo, though, that didn't really affect things all that much in the grand scheme because... 1993 marked the first time that Nintendo mentioned publicly that they were hard at work on their next console, along with the partnership between them and Silicon Graphics, boasting somewhat cheekily that this top-secret machine was going to be running on the same technology that powered Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park.
Cool. Well, Terminator.
Since they hadn't settled on a final name at the time, which would go on to take quite a while, Nintendo dubbed it Project Reality, which certainly whipped up a sizable amount of early expectations, as did the release date, which Nintendo assured was set for 1995. This announcement wasn't just intended for the home market though, as it was also revealed that Project Reality technology and games would first arrive in arcades as early as '94, which was almost true. While Rare's Killer Instinct did in fact use Silicon Graphics workstations to produce its rendered graphics, Cruisin' USA, a Midway Nintendo co-production, did not, despite the famous Attract screen.
Only on Nintendo Ultra 64.
Cruisin' used Midway's custom V-Unit hardware, which go on to be utilized for a variety of other games, like Off-Road Challenge and War Gods. So already, Nintendo was slightly fudging the numbers a little bit. And fudging the numbers was something they would need to continue to do if they wanted to have more games coming from third parties, because they were about to upset a good portion of them. When it was made official that cartridges were once again going to be the format in which Project Reality games would come in and cost $10 a pop or more depending on the cart size, and had to be purchased exclusively through Nintendo, well, this caused many publishers, including very prominent Japanese ones, to slide into Sony's DMs. You can't really blame them, because unlike older CD-based consoles, the PlayStation was designed to have games with both beefy storage capacity, but also be able to push polygons and 3D worlds farther than they had gone up to that point, so it was attractive for a number of reasons. Chiefly the fact that CDs cost $1 to manufacture and could be procured by almost anybody. To combat this exodus of support, Nintendo needed to reach out to other publishers and developers that were willing to play ball. And while this was an admirable move in that it helped put a number of smaller companies on the map in the next few years, it wasn't a 100% wholly successful venture. That's because when Nintendo revealed the Dream Team in 1994, a list of partners who would be providing software for Project Reality, it read more like a veritable "who's that" of the video game industry when compared to the likes of Square, Capcom, or Namco. These luminaries included Iguana Studios, Software Creations, Paradigm, Spectrum Holobyte, Ocean, and on top of them all, Mindscape. Nintendo tried their best to hype these up as big gets, and while it was certainly bolstered a little bit with the appearance of Midway and LucasArts, to many it felt like it was lacking a lot of the heavy hitters. Much better news would come a little bit later in '94, where Nintendo would confirm the console's final name, which was not its final name, and the price they were planning to sell it for, which was another very bold move. The Nintendo Ultra 64, an evolution of the Super moniker, would retail for $250, which was very competitive when stacked up against the toxic waste dump that was the $399 Amiga CD32, the $600 3DO, and even the $300 PlayStation. And you can't discount the fact that Nintendo touted this as a 64-bit machine, which was 3 plus 2 divided by carry the 1, twice the bits, hence twice the fun. They were able to keep the price so low due to the lack of a CD drive, which let Nintendo focus on other things like making 4 ports be the standard while also designing it so that controllers and even the console itself could be expanded. Ah, yes, the controllers. Outside of the console going all in on cartridges during a time when such a move was seen as not with it, it's probably still the most divisive design choice Nintendo had made. Reportedly, through 1994, their R&D division made over 100 prototype controllers of all shapes and sizes, but the central focus was always to design around its big innovation, which was the analog stick, as that would be key in controlling plumbers, monkeys, and futuristic bulldozers in 3D space. And while Nintendo's employees were encouraged to think outside the box with the ergonomics, and certainly did as such, it's not controversial to say that aside from most of the exclusive games like those from Rare and Nintendo themselves, not every genre or game was a good fit for the controller's 3-pronged design. As 1995 rolled around, Nintendo announced even more partners who would be pledging games for the Ultra 64, although sadly none of them were the bigger publishers that had started releasing hits over on the PlayStation and Saturn. What's even sadder is that a pretty big percentage of these newly announced Ultra 64 titles never even came out, as many languish in development hell until being quietly cancelled, such as Monster Dunk, Ultra Combat, Freak Boy, Buggy Boogie, and a port of the PC classic, Descent. As if that wasn't enough, behind the scenes at Nintendo R&D, things weren't going as smoothly or as speedily either. For close to 2 years, Nintendo proudly and loudly declared that the Ultra 64 would hit store shelves in '95, which would have it lock horns directly with the North American launch of the PlayStation. This would hopefully curtail any possible time advantage Sony thought they would have in that territory, an advantage they would actually totally wind up getting. Since it was already halfway into the year, Nintendo announced that, the Ultra 64 would slip to December of 1995 in Japan and spring of 1996 for North America, a delay which they said was due to wanting to make the software the best it could be. The truth, however, wasn't as cut and dry, because according to an October 1995 article in Upside magazine, SGI engineer Adrian Safarti said that this last-minute delay was directly caused by problems with the hardware itself. He claimed that the chips they were working on for Nintendo underperformed in testing, and thus needed to be redesigned, which caused a domino effect on the production timeline for the entire machine. What did that ultimately result in? Well, Nintendo having to tell all their partners that the final hardware was going to be weaker than what they initially had promised, which for many must have been a bitter pill to swallow. Up to that point, they had all been using powerful SGI PC workstations or other 3D technology, and now much of their work would need to be scrapped or repurposed to fit the lower specs, which turned out to be a pretty costly move. This delay meant that titles like Rare's arcade smash Killer Instinct would release much later than anticipated, if at all, and is why the SNES port even exists, which, to its credit though, proved to be, and I won't apologize for this, a killer app for the aging 16-bit machine, selling over 3 million copies. Nintendo at least had the foresight to then pivot and go hard on marketing the SNES throughout this delay, positioning it as a worthy rival to the 32-bit consoles, which it did so admirably throughout 1995.
Super Mario World 2 only on the Super NES, still the big one.
The SNES saw an incredible lineup of titles like the aforementioned KI, but also Donkey Kong Country 2, Earthbound, Yoshi's Island, Chrono Trigger, Mega Man X2, Secret of Evermore, Doom, and leading the pack, Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Get away! No! Now, while that was indeed an awesome year for SNES owners, I was personally going crazy at the time, it also meant another thing, that Sony, and to a lesser extent Sega, would have an undetermined amount of time battling it out with their next-gen consoles, and they were already enjoying a year-long head start on Nintendo over in Japan, a key territory. Still though, a few months wouldn't be all that bad, right? Well, in late 1995, at Nintendo's yearly Shoshinkai event, another small bump in the road occurred, which was a rather rare 11th hour alteration to the console's name. Originally, it was going to be known as the Ultra Famicom in Japan and Ultra 64 elsewhere, but in a move to unify the name across all territories, it was changed to what we all know today as the... Thank you. A suggestion that came from Earthbound creator Shigesato Itoi. The color scheme of the console was changed as well, something many have argued over the years hurt its perception somewhat, because the Ultra 64 was more of a un-Nintendo-like jet black, very sexy, but it was then altered to be a bit more family-friendly in the final prototype, featuring a lighter gray tone, more colorful logos, and slightly modified controllers. What was clear during this event though was that the console was imminently set to be released, what with the finalized name and look, and the announcement that the 64DD, a rather ugly disc-based expansion module, was also in development and would expand the base machine's capabilities with more memory, modem play, and user-created content, although Nintendo remained coy on its release date. The Shoshinkai event wasn't all good news, however, because while it did seem like it was going to be the console's big coming out event, it was actually kind of the opposite, in that it also heralded an announcement that would give the PlayStation even more time in the spotlight.
It's me, Mario!
Super Mario 64, which was poised to be the console's crown jewel, was coming along quite nicely. Not surprising though, considering much of the design of the machine itself had been tailor-made for it. However, Shigeru Miyamoto, who was sitting in the director's chair, had a problem. And that problem was, he felt the game simply wasn't good enough. Yet. If it was going to be Nintendo's first fully 3D affair and be their new home product's biggest selling point, it needed to be as perfect as it could, which meant more time for tweaking, polishing, and bug testing. So in what couldn't have been an easy conversation, Miyamoto had to convince the heads of Nintendo, including Hiroshi Hardcore Yamauchi, to delay the launch of the entire console yet again, so it could sync up with Mario 64's full completion. And so it was. At the event, a delay to June 1996 for Japan, September 30th for North America, and November for Europe was officially made official. Now, while obviously this was good for the overall quality of the launch titles, it also meant Sony was going to have an almost 2-year head start in their home country and now a full year everywhere else. At first, this didn't seem like it hampered the N64's hype much at all, as its launch was an unmitigated hit in Japan, selling out its initial 300,000 unit allotment, which caused Nintendo to ship another 200,000 over the coming weeks. Its launch lineup, however, wasn't exactly, robust. There was Mario 64, of course, which pretty much had a 1-to-1 attach rate, Pilot Wings 64, and Saikyo Habu Shogi, the true working horse of the launch titles. Now, while those numbers are certainly impressive, sales slowed down considerably in Japan over the coming weeks and then months. Why? Because those were the only 3 games available. It took until October, 4 months later, before more games finally started to hit the shelves, which definitely slowed down enthusiasm for the console, while it only grew for Sony's rival machine, especially with the impending release of Final Fantasy VII, which was coming out in just 2 short months. But during that painful, almost year-long delay, Sony and Sega had engaged in a bit of monetary warfare, slashing the price of their respective offerings, which certainly put pressure on Nintendo once again. So in August, just 1 month before the 64's launch in North America, the Big N announced the final retail price would be $199, something they pretty much had to do considering Sony had lowered theirs to the same number back in May. This meant Nintendo could no longer claim to be the most affordable option, and what's worse is that the extra year of being mostly uncontested meant that even more third parties had started delivering blockbuster hits for Sony. Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, Wipeout 2097, Tekken 2, Soul Blade, Ridge Racer Revolution, Twisted Metal 2, it was just relentless. Now, what did Nintendo bring to the North American launch, you may ask? Well, Mario, of course, Pilot Wings, and that's it. Like, we didn't even get Shogi? What the F? Crazy that after all those delays, third parties still weren't able to get their products out in time. Which was pretty much Nintendo's fault since they had to redesign all the console specs. But the problems, unfortunately, didn't stop there. The rest of 1996 saw only 8 more releases, although one of them was the hotly anticipated Shadows of the Empire, which debuted my beloved darling daddy, Dash Rendar. During all of this, though, the EU launch was pushed back even further, sliding from November all the way to March 1997, which really hamstrung Nintendo's momentum in that territory. On that note, 1997 saw a similarly slow but steady release of quality games, mostly from Nintendo themselves and the occasional member of the Dream Team, like Turok, Doom, Mario Kart, Star Fox 64, and peripherals like the mighty Rumble Pack, an innovation that's now standard in pretty much every controller made today. The proverbial needle, however, didn't actually move all that much until August, with the release of 007 GoldenEye, one of the few titles that forced PlayStation gamers to finally sit up and lock in. GoldenEye's gunplay, pause screen music, and its 4-player deathmatch was played in dorm rooms and basements all across the nation, selling 8 million copies in total, which was comparable to the lifetime sales of the original Metal Gear Solid. This was an example of one of the few things that the Nintendo 64 offered over its competitors, a strong and versatile multiplayer experience, which was all thanks to the 4 controller ports. Whether it was first-person shooters, racers, wrestling, or various party games, allowing a bunch of friends to just go ham without clunky multi-tap solutions was truly a unique selling point. Even with that advantage though, the hard truth was that GoldenEye was just one game, whereas the PlayStation was seeing multi-million selling blockbusters almost every month in all types of other genres, like fighting games, sports, and of course, RPGs. Regardless, 1998 was the peak of the N64's popularity, as it sold 9 million more units, but that number would then decrease every year thereafter, and the lack of RPGs, which are now broken into the mainstream, was often cited as one of the root causes for this lack of growth. Thankfully though, there was one game, a timeless action RPG, that was gearing up for launch by the end of that year, and as you'd expect, the hype for this milestone masterpiece was palatable. Quest 64 saw the young adventurer Brian exploring the magical world of Celtland, whereupon he had to— yeah, seriously though, it can't be overstated that despite the PlayStation's dominance, Ocarina of Time was all anyone could talk about for a good while. But although it did win tons of Game of the Year awards and sold another 7 million copies, third-party releases for the 64 kept dwindling month after month, as was the console's sales. Later releases like Super Smash Bros., the Mario Party series, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong, Majora's Mask, Perfect Dark, Kirby 64, and a very late but incredible port of Resident Evil 2 were all certainly feathers in Nintendo's cap, but they couldn't stop the downward slide, which saw the N64 selling about 6.5 million units throughout 2000. The good news was that was still a hell of a lot better than 2001, which dipped to 2.8 million, but that was at least expected given that the PS2 Double Ballin' was now out, with more next-gen machines on the horizon. Oh, and remember the unmemorable 64DD? Yeah, well that flopped in Japan too, and never saw a release outside of its shores. Doshin the Giant, you deserved better, my mammoth yellow friend. So, by late 2000, Nintendo had already thrown in the towel on marketing the 64 any further, evidenced by their final Shoshinkai event, which had been redubbed to Space World, where they focused almost entirely on GameCube demonstrations. And then, by E3 2001, the console was effectively dead. Even promising software that was originally set to come out for the N64, like Dinosaur Planet, Eternal Darkness, Kirby Riders, Resident Evil 0, and a Paper Mario sequel, were all quietly moved over to the Indigo Lunchbox, which was the proverbial final nail in the 64-bit coffin. Speaking of the Cube, Nintendo didn't really seem to learn all that much from their experience developing their first 64-bit machine, as many of the lessons you'd think they'd take to heart were not applied on their new venture, such as, well, just watch my whole episode on the GameCube for how they messed that up. Looking back now on the whole thing, one of the biggest indicators on just how badly Nintendo fared during this generation compared to the last one, and their decisions designing the N64, didn't just come down to console sales numbers. I mean, those were getting kind of bad, but rather the massive gulf in the quantity of titles released. Throughout its lifetime, the PlayStation's library swelled to over 4,000 games, which is obviously an incredible number, but it's even more impressive when you compare it to the 64, which only ever received 388. A stark, very sobering reminder that being stubborn and sticking to your guns is not always the right move. When Hiroshi Salty Fuck Yamauchi was asked as to why he felt the PlayStation had dominated, and particularly in Japan, he said, and this is his quote mind you, "Japanese gamers like to be alone in their rooms and play depressing games." So in summation, the Nintendo 64 was a big, bold swing that despite not becoming a giant mainstream success, lives on through its indelible library, which, while not extensive, has installed itself in many mind palaces. There's a reason why Nintendo still highlights the best of the best when it comes to the console today, and why it's still viewed with a potent wave of nostalgia by collectors and enthusiasts alike. So, hats off to you, you little gray Mario Zelda Rareware multiplayer Quest 64 machine. You were a bit weird, a bit behind the times, but damn it, you were memorable.
Thank you so much for playing my game.
And if you know of any other games, consoles, or movies that were also behind the times, let me know in the comments below or shout them out over on my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!